On the 11th of November 1965, Rhodesia, a British colony in the heart of Africa, proclaimed herself an independent sovereign state. In so doing, she became only the second country in modern times to have declared independence unilaterally, and the first since the 13 English colonies in America seceded from Great Britain in 1776. Rhodesia's action precipitated an international furor out of all proportion to her importance on the world scene. A matter of months earlier, Rhodesia had been no more than a name to the man in the street in Europe and America. Then this comparatively insignificant country of 4 million people rocketed to universal prominence, yet found herself all but isolated in a hostile world. Let us now turn the clock back to Thursday, November the 11th. At 1:15 p.m. on that momentous day, the streets of Rhodesia's towns and cities were strangely hushed. Lunch hour traffic had come to a standstill. Groups of people, white and black alike, had congregated around radio sets in offices, in restaurants, in cars, and on street corners. The tension was electric as the Prime Minister, the Hon Ian Douglas Smith, was announced. Listen to him now as history is made.
Your government has issued the following proclamation, which I will read to you. Whereas, in the course of human affairs, history has shown that it may become necessary for a people to resolve the political affiliations which have connected them with another people, and to assume amongst other nations the separate and equal status to which they are entitled. And whereas, in such event, a respect for the opinions of mankind requires them to declare to other nations the causes which impel them to assume full responsibility for their own affairs. Now, therefore, we, the government of Rhodesia, do hereby declare that it is an indisputable and accepted historic fact that since 1923, the government of Rhodesia have exercised the powers of self-government and have been responsible for the progress, development, and welfare of their people. That the people of Rhodesia, having demonstrated their loyalty to the Crown and to their kith and kin in the United Kingdom and elsewhere throughout 2 world wars, and having been prepared to shed their blood and give of their substance in what they believed to be the mutual interests of freedom-loving people, now see all that they have cherished about to be shattered on the rocks of expediency. That the people of Rhodesia have witnessed a process which is destructive of those very precepts upon which civilization and they have seen the principles of Western democracy, responsible government, and moral standards crumble elsewhere. Nevertheless, they have remained steadfast. That the people of Rhodesia fully support the requests of their government for sovereign independence, but have witnessed the consistent refusal of the government of the United Kingdom to accede to their entreaties. That the government of the United Kingdom have thus demonstrated that they are not prepared to grant sovereign independence to Rhodesia on terms acceptable to the people of Rhodesia, thereby persisting and maintaining an unwarrantable jurisdiction over Rhodesia, obstructing laws and treaties with other states, and the conduct of affairs with other nations, and refusing assent to laws necessary for the public good. All this to the detriment of the future peace, prosperity, and good government of Rhodesia. That the government of Rhodesia have for a long period, patiently and in good faith, negotiated with the government of the United Kingdom for the removal of the remaining limitations placed upon them and for the grant of sovereign independence. That, in the belief that procrastination and delay strike at and injure the very life of the nation, the government of Rhodesia consider it essential that Rhodesia should attain without delay sovereign independence, the justice of which is beyond question. Now, therefore, we, the government of Rhodesia, in humble submission to Almighty God, who controls the destinies of nations, conscious that the people of Rhodesia have always shown unswerving loyalty and devotion to Her Majesty the Queen, and earnestly praying that we and the people of Rhodesia will not be hindered in our determination to continue exercising our undoubted right to demonstrate the same loyalty and devotion, and seeking to promote the common good so that the dignity and freedom of all men may be assured, do, by this proclamation, adopt, enact, and give to the people of Rhodesia the Constitution annexed hereto. God save the Queen.
And so the months of speculation and suspense had ended. The deed had been done. But Rhodesia's decision to go it alone did not take the world completely by surprise. The Rhodesian and British governments had been haggling over mutually acceptable terms for independence since the breakup of the Central African Federation in 1963. Mr. Winston Field's Rhodesian Front Party was voted into power on an independence ticket. Not long afterwards, Mr. Smith took over as Prime Minister, and the pace quickened. Conferences and consultations on the independence question followed one another in rapid succession. The negotiations dragged on for over a year. By the third quarter of 1965, a long wake of discarded promises and compromises, warnings and accusations lay strewn over the political scene. If anything, the gap between the two governments had widened. On October the 1st, Mr. Smith was interviewed on Radio Rhodesia. He commented on the possibility of a UDI, a unilateral declaration of independence.
There are people who tend to say, we are doing pretty well as we are, so why not just continue as we are? Well, I believe that we either go forwards or we go backwards. To maintain the status quo means that we will start drifting. And when you drift at this game, you go backwards, you never go forwards. Surely memories cannot be so short. Let us think back to 1962. This was maintaining the status quo. And to say that we were drifting backwards then is putting it mildly, I would say. People with their money and their confidence, all of these things were roaring out of the country at that time. I am convinced, and I am completely convinced from all the evidence put before me, that we are doing pretty well today, because this government has made it clear that it will only move in one direction. That direction is forward, and that it is not prepared to tolerate any drifting. In any case, we are still negotiating, and I think it should be clear to all that the moment we discard our main weapon of UDI, we have lost these negotiations. So, even if you don't believe in UDI, this is certainly the wrong moment to give up the struggle. And, speaking for myself, I have always made it clear that if UDI is the only means of obtaining independence and saving our civilization, then I am in favor of such action. I don't think there can be any doubt in the mind of any fair-thinking man that no country in this world is more deserving of its independence today than Rhodesia, when one looks at our fantastic record. Moreover, the fact that we will be independent completely so, economically as well, unlike so many of these countries to the north of us, who have political independence but are tied to Britain's apron strings in nearly every other way. And when one considers that morally we are entitled to this, that we've had promises from Britain, for example, that we went to the Victoria Falls Conference dealing with the dissolution of the Federation on the clear understanding that they could not proceed without our assistance, and that if we went, as soon as this was over, the Rhodesia's independence would be attended to and would be finalized. So when one adds up all of these things, it is quite clear that we not only deserve this, but morally Britain is under an obligation to give us our independence. And what do you do when you find yourself in similar circumstances? That the other party to the agreement is unwilling to fulfill their moral obligations, I would say that Rhodesia is morally entitled to take matters into her own hands.
A few days later, Mr. Smith flew to London for what were referred to as final and conclusive talks with the British government. But the talks broke down, and Mr. Smith returned home. On October the 12th, the British Prime Minister, Mr. Harold Wilson, presented his case to the British people in a television broadcast.
I want to remind you of the record of this country over many years, under successive governments of different parties, in leading nations, previously colonies, subject peoples, to self-government and independence. Since the war, successive British governments have given freedom and independence to some 20 countries. Over 700 million people have been enfranchised and put in charge of their own destiny. And this is a record without parallel, without precedent in the whole course of human history. Heaven knows countries gaining their independence have made mistakes. Heaven knows there have been cases of arrogance and oppression and arbitrary rule. But against these disappointments, we have to set achievements such as the creation of the modern Commonwealth, no longer an empire, but a free group of independent nations, the greatest multiracial association in the world.
And he went on to say,
for nearly a year, we have been in discussion with the Rhodesian government, with Mr. Smith, to see if we could work out an agreed basis for independence. And what we've been trying to do is this, to reach an agreed solution on the basis of 5 principles on which we felt and on which we feel we must insist. First, if we were to break with every previous case and give them independence based on their existing constitution, then we must be sure that there would be guaranteed and unimpeded progress to majority rule. And second, we had to be sure that once they had their independence, no longer subject to the British Parliament, they wouldn't amend their constitution so as to make it even less democratic. Third, we said there must be an immediate improvement in the political status of the 4 million Africans. We didn't say, as in every other case, 1 man, 1 vote immediately, but we said there must be an improvement. Fourth, there must be progress towards ending the racial discrimination which is developed under the laws and the practices of the Rhodesian government. And fifth, we insisted, as our predecessors insisted a year ago, that before Rhodesian independence to Parliament, we must be satisfied that the conditions proposed for independence were acceptable to the people of Rhodesia as a whole.
Mr. Wilson conceded that so far no basis for agreement between the two governments had been found, and he issued a warning on the consequences of a UDI.
A UDI, a so-called independence illegally taken, could start a chain reaction in Africa of which no one could see the end. Many innocent people, men and women and children of all races, black and white, could lose their lives.
The British Prime Minister concluded with these words.
I know I speak for everyone in these islands, all parties, all our people, when I say to Mr. Smith tonight, Prime Minister, think again.
Mr. Smith was not long in replying to the British Prime Minister's comments. He took him to task on a number of points at a news conference in Salisbury.
Mr. Wilson stated that for over 40 years we have run our own affairs, our own parliament, made our own internal laws, but always subject to the ultimate authority of the Crown and the British Parliament. This is incorrect. Her Majesty's government relinquished her responsibilities to the people of Rhodesia in 1923, and ever since, until the 1961 Constitution was introduced, the government of Rhodesia has been the sole executive authority in and over the internal affairs of Rhodesia, and has been responsible to the exclusion of any other authority for the conduct of its affairs, with one limitation, namely, that any law proposed to be passed by the Rhodesian Parliament, which did not apply equally to the African and the European, had to be reserved for the assent of Her Majesty's government. A little later, he stated that under the 1961 Constitution, some 90,000 European electors were represented by 50 MPs, while perhaps 100,000 Africans qualified for the vote were represented by only 15 MPs. Of course, there are only about 10,000 Africans qualified, and so the representation is actually in favor of the African. Then further on, he referred to racial discrimination, which has developed under the laws and practices of the Rhodesian government. I believe it appropriate to point out that the British government has been as much party to this discrimination as has been the Rhodesian government. Indeed, the new 1961 Constitution is riddled with racial discrimination at the instigation of the British government and not the Rhodesian government. Then again, he expressed the opinion that a UDI may mean that many innocent people could lose their lives. I wish to make it clear that this could never happen as a result of anything done by the Rhodesian government. If British or other outside interferences were to promote this, then the responsibility would rest on their shoulders. Towards the end of his speech, Mr. Wilson claimed that there is an answer, namely, I quote, "We are prepared to go on talking, to examine even now the possibility of coming, at any rate, a little closer together on the issues which still so deeply divide us." However, earlier on, he said, and I quote, "And I have to tell you tonight that after all these months, and after a week of hard, straight talks, we are no nearer agreement than we were a year ago. On every one of the 5 principles, the disagreement is almost total, absolute." One of the most significant passages is where he says that Britain has given independence to over 700 million people, and that this is a record without parallel in the whole course of human history. But I would ask, what sort of independence is this? Does the British government know that in one case, because of the grant of independence, 3 million people were massacred, brutally murdered, twice as many as the Commonwealth dead in both world wars? Is this not a record without parallel in the whole course of human history? He concedes that countries gaining their independence have made mistakes. Against these disappointments, Mr. Wilson sets the achievements of, I quote, "a free group of independent nations, the greatest multiracial association in the world." But what does free mean in this context? Admittedly, it means one man, one vote, but it also means one candidate only. What does the greatest multiracial association in the world stand for when Commonwealth nations are openly at war with one another, and while some others are training saboteurs and stabbing in the back their neighboring fellow members? Now let me give you some examples of this wonderful democratic majority rule that Mr. Wilson is so irrevocably committed to. Look at the recent election in Nigeria, where a number of people were killed, houses were burnt, one voter was found with 40 ballot papers in his pocket, both parties claiming victory, and 2 party leaders proclaiming themselves as Prime Minister. Look at the totalitarian regime in Ghana with the elimination of a free and impartial judiciary, the Chinese communist takeover in Tanzania, the revolution and massacre in Zanzibar, the war in Cyprus, the suspension of the Constitution and the state of emergency in Aden, the recent rift between Malaysia and Pakistan. Are these the examples which the British government holds before us and tells us that we should emulate? Do not a number of these cases which I have referred to produce a record of how enlightened democratic civilizations have been transformed almost overnight into unenlightened totalitarian regimes? And is this not perhaps a record without parallel in the whole course of human history? Now for a few brief moments, let us look at the Rhodesian case.
Here we have one of the highest standards of civilization on the African continent, an enlightened democracy where color is no barrier and merit the only criterion, a judiciary the impartiality of which is world-renowned, a standard of living and opportunities for the indigenous African which is not exceeded in any country on the African continent to the north of us. Are these the things for which we stand condemned? A war service both in 1914 and 39, which was in keeping with that of the other civilized nations of the Commonwealth. They were prepared to use us then, but what do we find now? After 43 years of proving our case, we are told that we cannot be master in our own house. Is it not incredible that the British government has allowed our case to deteriorate into this fantastic position, almost comical if it were not so tragic? I believe I should say to Mr. Wilson, Prime Minister, think again.
Hopes for a negotiated settlement were waning. Mr. Wilson paid his first visit to Africa and Rhodesia in October to assess the situation at first hand. And in a last-minute bid to break the deadlock, he recommended that a royal commission be appointed to examine and report on the entire independence question. Here's Mr. Wilson speaking in Salisbury on October the 29th.
I believe that given time, a short time in my view, the proposed Royal Commission can hammer out a solution which can lead to a speedy and honourable and acceptable basis for independence, a solution which can take the brakes off Rhodesia's economic progress, a solution which can replace fear by cooperation and trust to achieve the material and moral greatness to which your natural environment, your national resources, the skill and quality of your people of all races have called you. And let me conclude by saying this. It will be the hope of every single one of your friends in Britain who have watched the events of these past few days with anxious hearts, even heavy hearts, that the wisdom of your political leaders of all races will lead your people under God in hope to the future we all desire for you.
The Rhodesian Prime Minister accepted in principle the appointment of a royal commission, but with reservations.
At government level, the differences are as wide apart and as irreconcilable as ever. There remains one possible chance, this Royal Commission, Mr. Wilson's very own suggestion, a high-level, independent, impartial body, free from political pressure. The Rhodesian government believe that the Commission should commence its task immediately. We now await Mr. Wilson's decision. At his press conference in Salisbury last Saturday morning, Mr. Wilson said, "The door is wide open for agreement. I wonder now if it is his intention to slam it closed again. If so, then the end of the road could be nearer than we think."
On his return to Britain, Mr. Wilson stated in the House of Commons that the British government reserved its position to accept or reject the findings of the proposed Royal Commission. To Smith's view, this stipulation amounted to a rejection of the terms of reference agreed to in Salisbury. The end of the road had been reached. The Rhodesian cabinet could see no alternative but to take matters into its own hands. Accordingly, independence was declared on November the 11th. Now there was no turning back for Rhodesia. Alone, she would be facing the combined wrath of almost every government in the world. The solemn being read, the Prime Minister addresses his audience, the Rhodesian nation.
Today, now that the nations has become evident, the end of the road has been reached. It has become abundantly clear that it is the policy of the British government to play us along with no real intention of arriving at a solution which we could possibly accept. Indeed, in the latest verbal and confidential message delivered to me last night, we find that on the main principle which is in dispute, the two governments have moved further apart. I promised the people of this country that I would continue to negotiate to the bitter end, and that I would leave no stone unturned in honourable and mutually accepted settlement. It now falls to me to tell you that negotiations have come to an end. No one could deny that we have striven with might and main, and at times leant over backwards, to bridge the gap which divides us from the British government. My ministers and I have not arrived at this decision without the deepest heart-searching. We have sat for days in ceaseless conference trying to find any possible way of achieving negotiated independence, as we undertook to the country that we would do. But I would be failing in my duty to all of you who live in Rhodesia if I was to permit this country to continue to drift in the present paralyzing state of uncertainty. The bitter lesson of the Federation is constantly in the forefront of my mind. In that case, matters were permitted to drift, and plans for action were formulated too late to prevent the destruction of this noble concept of racial harmony. However, Rhodesia has not rejected the possibility of racial harmony in Africa. The responsibility for the breakup of the Federation was Great Britain's alone. Their experiment failed, and they are now trying to foist this same dogma onto Rhodesia. We are determined that the same will never be allowed to happen here. Let no one believe that this action today marks a radical departure from the principles by which we have lived, or be under any misconception that now the Constitution will be torn up and that the protection of the rights of all peoples which are enshrined in that Constitution will be abrogated and discarded. Neither let it be thought that this event marks a diminution in the opportunities which our African people have to advance and prosper in Rhodesia. Far from this being the case, it is our intention, in consultation with the chiefs, to bring them into the government and administration as the acknowledged leaders of the African people, on a basis acceptable to them. It is our firm intention to abide by the Constitution. Indeed, we have never asked for anything other than in the Constitution, and only such amendments are included as are necessary to adapt it to that of an independent country. With regard to the position of members of Parliament, judges, civil servants, and members of the armed forces, as well as the police, provision has been made for all of them to carry on their duties, and all are deemed to have complied with the requirements of the new Constitution. They will continue to carry on their normal work. All present laws shall continue to operate, and the courts will enforce them in the normal manner. We are doing no more than assuming the rights which various British ministers have in the past indicated were ours. And in fact, this Constitution was the one which would carry out. Let no one be persuaded that this action marks a change in our attitude towards our neighbours in Africa, to whom we have ceaselessly extended the hand of friendship, and to whom we have nothing but goodwill and the best of intentions. We have never sought, nor will we ever seek to interfere or in any way attempt to influence their policy and their internal affairs. All we ask in return is their goodwill in permitting us to look after what are, after all, our own private and domestic matters. I wish to make it quite clear, as indeed I have on many occasions in the past, that we in this country have no quarrel whatsoever with the people of Great Britain. The differences of opinion which we have are entirely with successive British. The people of Britain are the kith and kin of many Rhodesians, and the people with whom we have the closest affinity, both in our way of life and in our conception of justice and civilization. How can anyone suggest that we would harbor hostile sentiments against those with whom we fought shoulder to shoulder against the common enemy in 2 world wars? Our admiration and friendship for the people of Great Britain is real and enduring. Let there be no doubt that we in this country stand second to none in our loyalty to the Queen, and whatever else other countries may have done or may yet do, it is our intention that the Union Jack will continue to fly in Rhodesia and the national anthem continue to be sung. Most of you, I know, have longed for this day, but a few, on the other hand, have had reservations. However, I would say to you that there can be no future for this great and splendid country of ours if we are to remain drifting in this constitutional twilight. To those who believe that it would be in our own interest to continue as we are, I would point out that the British Prime Minister implied in a speech to Parliament on his return from Rhodesia that should the result of the Royal Commission go against Rhodesia, the British government reserved the right to call a conference, which further implied the changing of our constitution as a result. It would appear that if this is the British government's real intention, we shall not be allowed to go on as we are, even if there had been a Royal Commission. There can be no solution to our racial problems while African nationalists believe that provided they stir up sufficient trouble, they will be able to blackmail the British government into bringing about a miracle on their behalf by handing the country over to irresponsible rule. There can be no happiness in this country while the absurd situation continues to exist, where people such as ourselves, who have ruled ourselves with an impeccable record for over 40 years, are denied what is freely granted to other countries who have ruled themselves in some cases for no longer than a year. There can never be long-term prosperity, which is so necessary for the nurturing of our endeavors to improve the standard of living and increase the happiness and better the lot of all our people, whilst the present uncertainty exists. No businessman could ever seriously contemplate massive long-term investment in a country in which chaos and confusion were always the future possibilities. Whatever the short-term economic disadvantages may be, in the long term, steady economic progress would never be achieved unless we are masters in our own house. To those of you who fear the short-term effects of economic sanctions, I would say that whilst we in no way minimize the possible hardship and inconvenience they may bring about, nonetheless, we are firmly convinced that in the long run, because of our natural resources and the enterprise of our people, there will be brought about a prosperous and better future for everyone. Week after week, we have seen businessmen passing through here on their way to South Africa, who, with few exceptions, say that while this state of uncertainty continues, they will not even contemplate a serious investigation of the possibility of investment. However, they also say that once we have solved our constitutional difficulties and are independent, then they will be very interested in undertaking serious investigations and inquiry with a view to investing. That some economic retributions will be visited upon us, there is no doubt. Those who seek to damage us do not have any great concern for the principles to which they endlessly pay lip service. For if they really believed in these principles which they ceaselessly proclaim, then they could not possibly connive at the many disasters which have been brought about by the premature withdrawal of European influence from countries in Africa and Asia, who were nowhere near ready for it. There is no doubt that the talk of threats and sanctions is no more than appeasement to the United Nations, the Afro-Asian bloc, and certain members of the Commonwealth, and undoubtedly some action will be taken. But I cannot conceive of a rational world uniting in an endeavor to destroy the economy of this country, knowing, as they undoubtedly do, that in many cases the hardest hit would be the very people on whose behalf they would like to believe they are invoking these sanctions. We, for our part, will never do anything in the nature of taking revenge on any neighboring African state for what other countries may do to us. But it is none the less inevitable that if our economy should contract as a result of such actions taken by others, then what jobs were available would have to be reserved for our own Africans, thus bringing hardship not only on our own people, but also those people from adjoining territories who work here. If, as some have predicted, there are repercussions elsewhere in Africa, I would warn those people who contemplate taking action that it will be their actions and not ours that have precipitated these events. Whatever the consequences may be, and whatever difficulties may present themselves, we are a people who in the past have survived and prevailed in circumstances of the utmost adversity. The mantle of the pioneers has fallen on our shoulders, and we will, I am sure, be able to face any difficulties which may occur, fortified by the same strength and courage which distinguished our forefathers in days gone by. I do not believe that many of the extreme consequences which have been forecast by various would-be Cassandras, both here and abroad, will come to pass. But whatever may befall us, I have the profoundest confidence and belief in the determination of our people to stand united and to prevail in the face of any adversity. The safety of our homes and the freedom of our people alike depend upon the conduct of each one of us at this critical time. In the lives of most nations, there comes a moment when a stand has to be made for principle, whatever the consequences. This moment has come to Rhodesia. I pray, and I hope other Rhodesians will also pray today, that our government will be given the wisdom and the strength to bring Rhodesia safely through. I call upon all of you in this historic hour to support me and my government in the struggle in which we are engaged. I believe that we are a courageous people, and history has cast us in a heroic role. To us has been given the privilege of being the first Western nation in the last 2 decades to have the determination and fortitude to say, so far and no further. We may be a small country, but we are a determined people who have been called upon to play a role of worldwide significance. We Rhodesians have rejected the doctrinaire philosophy of appeasement and surrender. The decision which we have taken today is a refusal by Rhodesians to sell their birthright. And even if we were to surrender, does anyone believe that Rhodesia would be the last target of the communists and the Afro-Asian bloc? We have struck a blow for the preservation of justice, civilization, and Christianity. And in the spirit of this belief, we have this day assumed our sovereign independence. God bless you all.
The British government reacted sharply to Rhodesia's unilateral declaration. A bill was rushed through Parliament enabling Her Majesty's government to amend or revoke the Rhodesian constitution and to apply sanctions against her former colony. Rhodesian reserves in Great Britain were seized. Mr. Wilson appealed to the United Nations for support to end the so-called rebellion. An oil embargo was declared and enforced by the British government. Rhodesia tightened her belt. But she was still obtaining her vital supplies from other sources. And the Rhodesian people of every race and color became united as never before in the face of the common threat. Mr. Smith broadcast a New Year's Eve message to the nation.
On this New Year's Eve, 1965, we, the people of Rhodesia, have much to be thankful for. After 43 years of successful government, we are at last an independent, sovereign nation, a nation to which we can dedicate ourselves with pride and determination. Rhodesia, as you know, is a wonderful country, richly endowed with resources of all kinds. But I would say to you that the most important and the greatest of all our resources is in the strength, knowledge, skills, and above all, the dedicated loyalty of all the Rhodesian people. On the day we assumed our independence, Rhodesia stepped forward calmly and confidently into a new future. In the weeks which have passed since then, our country has continued to be a model of peace and stability, which is the envy of countries less fortunate than ours. This peace and tranquility has been maintained in the face of the most appalling threats of all kinds. It has been maintained in the face of punitive sanctions and the masterly, vicious, and even vindictive propaganda of a country which we once held in the highest esteem. Rhodesians, strong in the knowledge that their cause is a right and a just one, have merely smiled in the face of such actions. We know that behind the smile there is the resolution of a united people, ready and willing to meet any threat. We will emerge from this exercise a far, far stronger nation and a more united nation than ever before in our history. Indeed, all that has happened so far merely reinforces us in our conviction that on that historic day we took the right step for the preservation of civilization in this part of the African continent. Moreover, I am convinced that when the final story of Rhodesia's successful struggle for nationhood is written, history will recount the retribution which in turn will be exacted from those who today dance the tune of world communism in the guise of democratic institutions.
At the Commonwealth Prime Minister's Conference in Lagos on January the 14th, Mr. Wilson accepted that the use of force against Rhodesia could not be precluded. However, no suggestions were made as to who would supply and finance a force of sufficient strength. But the screws were tightened on Rhodesia. That same month, a total embargo on all trade was declared. Belts were tightened a little more. But there was no sign of the Rhodesian defenses cracking. On February the 10th, Mr. Smith again broadcast to the Rhodesian people, reviewing the first 3 months of independence.
90 days have passed since we became independent, and I think it appropriate to make a brief summary. So far, things have gone better than we anticipated in most spheres. In the financial war, in spite of his unscrupulous, indeed immoral actions, we have beaten Mr. Wilson, thanks to the magnificent combined efforts of the Ministry of Finance and our central bank. In the war to boycott the purchase of Rhodesian goods, once more we are managing to beat Mr. Wilson every day, due to the quality of our products and the efforts of all those concerned. In the propaganda war, because of the wonderful spirit and the sound common sense of the Rhodesian people, Mr. Wilson's efforts have been thrown back in his face. The record shows that Mr. Wilson gave undertakings that sanctions would not be punitive or vindictive, and indeed that they would not be taken to the stage where they would harm the Rhodesian economy. What has happened? In actual fact, Mr. Wilson's actions have been a model of vindictiveness, and if the word punitive is inappropriate, this can only be because it is too mild for the circumstances. Already, because of the actions of one man, bitterness has been engendered in Rhodesia against Britain. This man is also responsible for severing the very strong economic links which have been built between our two countries over the past 75 years. The same man, to disrepute the good name of British banking institutions and trust houses, I am advised that the estimate already made in Britain that this Rhodesian exercise will cost the British nation £300 million per annum is an underestimate. The same man is prepared to squander on an abortive face-saving exercise this considerable sum of money which he is taking away from the British taxpayer.
Mr. Smith went on to talk about the impossibility of attempting to legislate for Rhodesia by politicians divorced from the issues involved by both distance and sentiment. He continued,
"We here in Rhodesia know what the Rhodesian wants: to be left alone, to get on with his work and to solve his problems. And since November the 11th, he is even more certain, more definite in his mind about this. Fortunately, this applies not only to the European, but to the African as well. The feeling which is growing through all sections of our community is that we are all Rhodesians and we all live in Rhodesia. So let's get together and sort out our future free from outside interference."
Finally, the Prime Minister expressing not only the convictions of his government, but also the sentiments of the electorate on the course they had taken.
The truth, which is conceded even by our enemies, is that the people of Rhodesia have never before in our history been so united in their support of a government. As reported in the news columns last week, a sample survey by a visiting Canadian journalist revealed 96% support for our. Should be no surprise to anyone who knows what the alternative will be. It was made very clear in the letter sent by Mr. Wilson to a prominent African nationalist shortly before the Labour Party came to power. And this has been Labour's consistent policy ever since, namely that the 1961 Constitution, with its evolutionary process, is too slow and must be changed to a pattern of rapid handover as soon as possible, even if this means a repetition of the breakdown of civilization and democracy such as we have witnessed to our north, even if this means that communism takes another step forward on the African continent. We all know that the decision we took on the 11th of November was the only possible one open to us if we are to maintain our country and our civilization. That day, we saw the true birth of our Rhodesian nation, and with every day that passes, we are becoming stronger and more united.